Welcome to the channel, guys. My name is Aleksi, and on this channel I cover all things Azure. In this video series, I'm going to cover one of my favorite tools on Azure, and that is Data Factory. In this video series, I will cover many topics related to Azure Data Factory and show how you can use it to build and orchestrate your own data pipelines in Azure. This is the part one in this video series, and in this video I'm going to go through the basic concepts of the Data Factory, show how you can deploy your own Data Factory to your own subscription in Azure, and then show a quick demo how you can use the Data Factory to copy data from Blob Storage. Okay, let's dive in. Okay, Azure Data Factory, what is it? Basically, Azure Data Factory is a cloud-based data integration service running on Microsoft Azure. It enables the creation, scheduling, and management of data pipelines to move and transform data. It offers over 100 different connectors to Azure and non-Azure services that include a lot of relational databases, software, and other kinds of systems. It has this very intuitive and easy to use drag and drop interface where you can drop in your activities and start to build your pipeline very conveniently. Let's talk about the costs. How expensive is this tool to use? It kind of depends how you use it, because it's based on the pay-as-you-go pricing model. So basically it can be crazy expensive or doesn't really cost anything. So it means that there is not really an upfront cost for setting up the Data Factory, but you will pay for the computing power that you use. This kind of a basic cloud setup that you pay for the resources that you consume. So it kind of depends. If you have just a tiny pipelines moving a few kilobytes of data, or you have huge pipelines moving hourly terabytes of data, then the cost of the Data Factory is going to be a lot different. Now let's cover a very typical use case for Azure Data Factory. Let's imagine a situation that we have some imaginary company and they have their on-premise servers and they are running their CRM system there and their SAP system there. But this company has also an Azure environment, and in this environment they have their centralized analytics database, which they are using for their company-wide analytics. They have a lot of Power BI reporting built on top of that database. And now they would like to get the data from their CRM and ERP to this centralized database. How they would do that? Of course, the obvious answer is Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory can pull in data from both of these systems and write it to that centralized analytics database, so it is available for Power BI reporting to use. So what do you need if you want to try out the Data Factory? First things first, you would need some type of Azure environment, meaning an Azure subscription. Then what you need is an Azure account to log into that subscription. Third thing that you need is a resource group in Azure. And I'm not going to cover resource group in much detail in this video, but basically you can think of it as this kind of a container for all of your Azure resources. So it kind of logically groups them nicely together. And last thing that you would need is a sufficient access to be able to create the Data Factory. But if that is your own Azure environment, then that shouldn't be an issue. Now we have covered the very basics of Azure Data Factory and we have core understanding what kind of tool it is. So the next step is to deploy Azure Data Factory to our Azure subscription. Okay, now we are in the Azure portal. So as you can see, I have my Azure subscription, I have my Azure account, and I know that I have sufficient access because this is my own Azure subscription. So what we still need is a resource group. So let's create one. I will open a resource groups tabs, click create, change the location to West Europe because that is the big data center closest to me. And then I'm gonna name my resource group. And it's always good to think about the naming convention for your Azure resources. Okay, I click next, no tags needed, and then I'm ready to create the resource group. Now it's done. We can now go to our resource group, click create, search for Data Factory in the marketplace, click create, and name our Data Factory with appropriate naming convention. and then change the location to West Europe as well. And we will create the Data Factory v2 because the v1 no longer exists and we wouldn't want to use that anyways. No Git configuration needed and no need to touch network, advanced or tags. Now we can just proceed to the creation of the resource. Hit create and then Azure starts to deploy your Data Factory. This could take a little while, but usually it's not too bad with the Data Factory. Some other Azure resources take way longer to be deployed. Okay, now the deployment has been completed and let's refresh our resource group until we have the Data Factory there. Now it's there. Let's open it up and launch the studio. Okay, now the studio is opening up. And first things first, let's enable the dark mode because we do not want to burn our eyes with this very bright UI. And now let's have a quick tour around the Data Factory UI. On the left sidebar, we have the buttons that will take us to all the different sections of Data Factory. First in the list, we have the Home button. Then we have the Author button that allows us to create pipelines. We can check that out now. So basically, this is the place where you can craft your data pipelines. I will now quickly demonstrate to you how the pipeline creation happens in the Data Factory UI. So basically, we can click here and select New Pipeline. This opens up the pipeline development view. And now we can click through the bunch of activities that we have here available in the Data Factory. Basically, these are your transformations for your data pipeline. And now we can throw a couple of them to the pipeline just to demonstrate how the development process happens in the Data Factory. Of course, we cannot really do anything with those now because we don't have any datasets or linked services here in the Data Factory. Here in the development view, we have few other objects that can be created, but we are only gonna cover datasets in this video. So here we could click a new dataset and we would be able to create a dataset to some linked service. For example, to a Blob Storage, some random file. Okay, let's continue the UI tour and go to the Manage tab. This is the place where you can build your linked services. And setting up the linked services allows you to connect to different data stores. As you can see, we have a huge list of data stores and resources where we can natively connect with the Data Factory. And this list is ever expanding thanks to Microsoft. But for now, we are not going to create any linked services. And then the last tab that we're going to cover is the Monitor tab, and here you can monitor your data pipeline runs when they are running, but we don't have anything running right now. So this looks completely empty for now. Okay, now we have our own Data Factory up and running. So next we are going to dive a little bit more deeper into those core concepts of Data Factory, meaning to linked services, datasets, activities, and pipelines, and explain a bit what they mean and how those concepts tie together. So let's dive into it. Okay, let's cover Data Factory's core concepts in a bit more detail. Let's start with the linked service. Basically, linked service is a connection to an external resource like SQL database. And then we have a dataset, which is kind of a metadata about the actual data in some linked services. You can think of it as an instructions for Data Factory to receive data. Then we have an activity. Basically, this is your processing step in a data pipeline. And then finally, we have the pipeline that logically groups activities together and forms your actual data pipeline. And now let's digest all of these concepts a little bit more. Let's start with the linked service. What is it? Basically, it links your data store or external compute resource to Data Factory. Linked service stores the connection information to your external data store, like for example SQL database, the connection string, or the connection info, how to access that data store. It also handles the connection in a way that on Data Factory side you don't really have to code at all or worry about drivers or anything like that. Currently Data Factory supports over 100 different linked services, along with some very general ones like ODBC and REST that allows you to connect to even more data stores that are not really natively supported as a linked service yet. Next, let's cover Dataset in a bit more detail. Basically, you can think of it as an object in Data Factory that will point to some data in the linked service. For example, we could use a dataset to describe a CSV file in Blob Storage. This dataset would contain information on that file. For example, what is the container in the Blob Storage where that file can be found, and what is the exact path to that file, and what is the file type, and what is the separator. So when Data Factory goes and picks that file up, it has the instructions to read it. Next, we have activities. Basically, activities are your processing steps in your data pipeline. And these activities often consume data sets. For example, if you're copying data from place A to B, then you would need data sets in order to do that, because otherwise Data Factory wouldn't have any instructions for copying the data. Activities can be roughly divided to 3 different categories. First category is data movement activities. These are basically your copy data activities that copy data from set data store to another data store. Then we have data transformation activities. These are your external computing resources that you can link to Data Factory. For example, if you want to run some Python logic in Databricks notebook and run that as part of your pipeline, you can do that. Or run a stored procedure in SQL database, or maybe implement an Azure function as part of your data pipeline. Then the last group is control activities, and control activities are used for the pipeline control flow. For example, if you want to put some conditional logic to your pipeline or receive metadata about some files, these are basically your control activities. And when we start logically grouping activities together, we get a pipeline. So basically, as an example, in the pipeline first, we could have a copy data activity that would copy data from the SFTP server to Azure Blob Storage. This would be the activity number 1 in our pipeline. Next, we could have a Databricks notebook that would read the data from the Azure Blob Storage and run some Python calculations for that data, and then write it back to an Azure Blob Storage. Lastly, we could have another copy activity that would then copy that refined data from Azure Blob Storage to Azure SQL database, for example, for reporting purposes. And here we have an example how this kind of pipeline would look like in the Data Factory UI when we would actually build this in Data Factory. Now I hope you have some type of understanding what is a linked service, what is a data set, what is an activity, what is a pipeline, and how all of those concepts tie together. Next, we are going to do a quick demo where we are going to copy some data from Blob Storage back to the same Blob Storage. I'm not going to explain in detail in this video what is a Blob Storage, but for now you can think about it as our file system in cloud. Now let's create a Blob Storage. For that we will need a storage account. Let's go to the marketplace and search for storage account. Here we have it. Now let's create one. Okay, click create. And subscription is correct, resource group is correct. Now we need to give it a name. Again, pay attention to your naming conventions. I'm naming this with my naming convention that I have been using in this environment. Also, the region is already correct, West Europe, that I want to use. And everything else is fine, and we don't need to touch any other settings, so we can just proceed to the review step and create this storage account. Okay, let's create it. Now it has been deployed, and let's go to our resource group, and there it is. Now let's open up our storage account and let's create few blob containers here. Okay, so I will create first one container and I will give it a name that will describe the use case for this specific container. It's going to be demo1 source. And let's create that. And now let's create another one, demo1 sync. Okay, create that. And now we have two containers here. Okay, cool. Next, I will give Azure Data Factory access to those blob containers that I just created. I will use Azure Data Factory's managed identity for giving that access. Managed identity is kind of out of scope for this video, but you can think of it as giving Azure Data Factory a permission to access those. Basically, if you think about Azure Data Factory as a person that we are giving access to blob containers. I'm going to give this access on the resource group level. So I will go to my resource group access control and click add new role assignment and search for blob data contributor, because this role will allow Azure Data Factory to read, write and delete blobs in the blob container. And that should be enough. We want to select the assign access to managed identity and then find our managed identity here in the list. There it is. And now let's assign it. Let's click review and assign. Cool. Now Azure Data Factory has access to our blob containers on resource group level. Okay, let's go back to the Data Factory. Let's go to manage and then to linked services and click new. Here we have Azure Blob Storage. Let's create a new linked service for Blob Storage. And again, use the naming convention that you are comfortable with. I'm gonna name my linked service for now with the LS. That means linked service underscore ST, which means storage account, and then underscore stage, which means this kind of a staging area for data. This is going to be my naming convention for now. And then for the authentication type, let's use system assigned managed identity. And next we need to type out the service endpoint, meaning the blob storage address. Basically the blob storage address is https your storage account's name.blob.core.windows.net. After we have typed that out to the service endpoint field, we can test the connection. It should be successful. Yes, it is. And now we can create the linked service. Let's hit create. Okay, now we have created our first linked service. And when we want to save in Data Factory, if we don't have Git configured, we can click this publish button. And this will basically save these changes to the Data Factory. Next, let's upload some data to our source container. Let's find our source container here, and then we can click upload. Now I will drag and drop here one file. The file that I uploaded is just a basic txt file with some little content in it, but because we are going to perform a binary copy in Data Factory, we don't really need to care about the file contents at this stage. So basically we are just moving a binary block from place A to B, and A place will be our source container and B place going to be our sync container. Now let's go back to the Data Factory and create our first pipeline. And for pipeline creation, we need to open the Author tab and click Pipelines, and from those three dots, click New Folder first, because we want to stay organized here, and then click New Pipeline. This will open the pipeline development view. Here we can remind ourselves that there are plenty of different activities to choose from in the Data Factory, but today we are only going to use one of these, and it is going to be the copy data activity, which is found on top of the activity list. It's one of the most basic and most used activities here. So let's drag and drop that in. And now we would need to configure the source and the sync. But before that, let's name our copy data activity accordingly so we know what it is doing. It's always good to name your activities so that they reflect the purpose that you are using them. Okay, so we don't have any datasets created, so we need to create a new one. And we can do it from the Datasets tab. And let's create a new folder for that one as well. Name it in the similar way than our pipeline folder. And let's click create. And now let's create a new dataset. Let's select Azure Blob Storage, select binary, and then let's name our dataset according to good naming conventions. And then let's select the linked service that we want to use that we just created. And now let's go find our dataset in that linked service. Okay, it's there, and now we can create it. Now we can go back to our pipeline and configure our pipeline source to use this dataset that we just created. Okay, now it has been configured. Nice and easy. But we still need a sync dataset. So let's repeat this process one more time. Let's create a new dataset, Azure Blob Storage, select binary, and then again name the dataset accordingly so we can keep this data factory nice and organized. And then select the linked service. And after this, we need to configure the file path. Now we are going to choose the sync container. And since we don't have any files there yet, we leave it as so, and we write our file name here. I'm going to change the file name slightly. Now let's click OK. So now we have the sync dataset, so we can go back to our pipeline and configure that to our sync. And ta-da! Now we have successfully configured our copy data activity. Before we are going to test this, I will change the pipeline name to something else than just pipeline 1, because I like to be organized, like I have said multiple times during this video. And let's type something that reflects what this pipeline does. So I will say that it's PL demo1 copy from source to sync. Not the best name, but goes for now. So now we can proceed to testing part. We can hit the debug button here and try this out. By hitting this debug button, I will trigger a test run for my pipeline, and now I need to wait a bit until it will complete the test run. This shouldn't take more than a few seconds, and now it's already done. We can check what happened. So files read 1, files written 1, seems to be correct. Now let's go back to our storage container and check if there is a new file in our sync. And we have the copied data.txt here. So everything went fine. Okay, now last thing that we can do is to publish all these changes since our fancy pipeline is now working. And now after we have published those, we have saved these changes to our data factory. And we are basically done with this demo here. Okay, that's everything that I wanted to cover today. I hope you got the overall idea what is Azure Data Factory as a tool and what is it used for. Don't worry if some of the topics in this video were left a bit unclear, since we're going to come back to those and cover them in way more detail in upcoming videos. If you have any other Azure or Data Factory related topics that you would like to see me cover on this channel, leave a comment to the comment section down below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more Data Factory and Azure content. See you in the next video.